Putin built his entire war strategy around Crimea. He spent a decade turning the peninsula into the most fortified piece of territory in Europe, a 250-year-old naval base, power projection into the Mediterranean, approval ratings that surged to 89% after the 2014 annexation, the cornerstone of the narrative that holds his regime together, indispensable for Putin, but equally so for Ukraine for the opposite reasons. As long as Crimea remains in Russian hands, peace is an illusion. Caliber missiles launched from Sevastopol reach all the way to Kyiv. The Sea of Azov stays completely locked. Mariupol can never function as a port again. Southern Ukraine lies under a permanent existential threat. If the peninsula is retaken, the message to every authoritarian regime is crystal clear: conquest can be reversed. And the pressure on Putin is growing heavier by the day. Supply lines are under fire. The fleet has already retreated. Air defenses are being stripped every single night. On the front, the offensive has stalled. Behind the lines, Ukraine's drones reach from Moscow all the way to the Caucasus. If this war is going to end, it ends in Crimea. Both sides are locked in. Ukraine must take it back. Russia believes it can never let go. And according to retired Lieutenant General Ben Hodges, the balance has already begun to shift. Crimea is the decisive terrain of this war. Liberate Crimea and everything changes. He laid out exactly how it would happen in 3 phases. Phase 1 is already underway on the ground. To understand why Hodges is so focused on Crimea, you only need to look at the map. Crimea is a peninsula, but logistically it behaves like an island. Everything the garrison needs arrives through 2 choke points: the Kerch Bridge from the east and the M14 highway corridor from the north through occupied southern Ukraine. Cut both and the peninsula becomes an island. And islands under siege have a very specific history. Singapore 1942, 80,000 British soldiers surrendered just 2 weeks after the supply line was cut. Guadalcanal, the Japanese garrison starved when the US Navy severed the Tokyo Express. In both cases, the fortress was strong, the walls held, but the supply line didn't, and that decided everything. But Crimea isn't just a military problem, it's the emotional and political center of gravity for both sides. Sevastopol isn't just a port. It's Russia's only gateway for power projection into the Mediterranean and the Middle East. Losing Sevastopol means the collapse of Russia's entire southern strategic depth. Hodges is blunt. No peace negotiation can succeed if Russia keeps Crimea. It would mean permanent dismemberment of Ukraine and a dangerous precedent for every occupied territory on Earth. And Hodges has a model for how this changes, not through invasion but through strangulation. Hodges' model consists of 3 simultaneous phases, not sequential. All 3 operating at once, reinforcing each other. Phase 1: isolation. Cut every route feeding the peninsula, the bridge, the highway, the sea lanes, the pipeline, squeeze them all. Hodges is direct. Eventually, that bridge will come down, but you don't even need to destroy it. Just stop the traffic. And that's precisely what's happening. Sections of the M14 corridor are now under Ukrainian drone fire control. The Kuban-Crimea gas pipeline has been sabotaged by partisans. The Black Sea Fleet has entirely abandoned Sevastopol. The last warship departed in July 2024. The strategic logic is clear. You don't need to storm a fortress, you can starve it. Phase 2: make it unbearable. Over the past 4 months, Ukraine's mid-range strike drones have destroyed over 500 Russian air defense units. The asymmetry is striking. Ukraine's drone costs $250,000. The air defense system Russia loses trying to stop it costs $15 million. Every exchange bleeds Russia's budget. In July 2025, the Nebo-M radar at Cape Tarkankut was destroyed, opening a massive coverage gap across western Crimea. A drone corridor into Crimea. Phase 3: economic collapse. Russia's refineries are burning. Refining capacity has dropped 10%. Hodges: destroy Russia's oil and gas exports. Apply immense economic pressure. At some point, Russia simply can't sustain its forces in Crimea. 3 phases, 1 objective. Not by breaking the walls, but by emptying the supply rooms behind them. We'll call it the Crimean chokehold. What makes this so dangerous for Putin? He sees exactly what's happening and can't stop it. Russia is pouring resources into Crimea's defense. S-400 batteries have been repositioned. Putin has even deployed experimental laser systems at Sevastopol. But Hodges points out that this defensive buildup is actually Ukraine's advantage. They're forcing Russia to waste resources defending Crimea. Every ruble spent on bunkers in Sevastopol is a ruble that doesn't reach the front line. In Zaporizhia, and this is the trap, Putin cannot escape, defend Crimea heavily and the front lines weaken. Russia pulled VDV units from Donetsk to reinforce the south. The Pokrovsk offensive stalled partly because of it. Putin chose Crimea over Donetsk, an implicit admission of which front he fears losing more. Defend Crimea lightly and Ukraine strikes accelerate. Ignore the supply line threat and the garrison slowly starves. Putin has fallen into a resource dilemma. Every move he makes to solve one problem creates two more. A historical parallel illuminates this. In World War II, Germany's Sixth Army was surrounded at Stalingrad. Hitler refused to authorize a breakout. He believed the Luftwaffe could supply the garrison by air. It couldn't. The army froze, starved, and surrendered. No one is suggesting Crimea will end identically, but the structural dynamic is the same. A leader who won't let go of territory he can no longer sustain, because the political cost of withdrawal exceeds the military cost of staying until it doesn't. Putin knows Crimea is becoming unsustainable. His actions prove it. The fleet retreat, the experimental weapons, the diversion of resources from other fronts. But admitting it publicly would shatter the narrative that holds his regime together, so he doubles down. And every doubling down makes the eventual reckoning worse. Quick side note, you're watching the Military Report, and if you haven't subscribed yet, now's the time. Hodges sees three possible trajectories. Scenario 1, accelerated isolation. If the Kerch Bridge's rail section goes permanently offline, Crimea's heavy military supply capacity drops to near zero overnight. Scenario 2, sustained squeeze. Even if the bridge holds, expanding drone coverage and systematic air defense destruction create a slow-motion erosion. Crimea doesn't collapse, it decays. Hodges noted, the Russians in Crimea will slowly feel themselves being cut off, and that feeling is devastating to morale. Scenario 3, the nuclear card. Putin has waived the nuclear option for 4 years without playing it, and every unused threat erodes its credibility further. Hodges leans towards Scenario 2, gradual strangulation that avoids escalation risks while achieving the same result through logistics. But he also looks beyond Crimea. He doesn't think Putin's next target will be the Baltics. He thinks it will be the Caucasus, Georgia, the Caspian corridor, regions not protected by NATO's Article 5. Salami slicing. Hodges calls it a slice every 5 to 10 years, never enough to trigger collective defense, always enough to expand. We have discussed the military dimension of Crimea, but there is something else this peninsula holds in its grip. And perhaps in the long run, something even more decisive than the military dimension, the Black Sea. Before the war, Ukraine conducted over 90% of its grain exports by sea. The ports of Odessa, Chornomorsk, and Pivdeny were the backbone of this export. Ukraine was one of the world's largest exporters of wheat and sunflower oil. The food security of millions of people, from Africa to Southeast Asia, depended on these ports. In 2022, Russia blockaded these ports. The Grain Corridor Agreement provided temporary relief, but Russia withdrew from the agreement in 2023, and Crimea is at the heart of this blockade. Russian warships and submarines departing from Sevastopol can threaten commercial vessels. Aircraft taking off from air bases in Crimea keep the Western Black Sea within their range. Ukraine opened an alternative corridor on its own. After removing the fleet from Sevastopol, it established a new trade route along the western coast of the Black Sea. Thanks to this route, grain exports have approached pre-war levels. But this corridor is fragile. As long as Crimea remains under Russian control, every ship is a potential target. Insurance premiums are high. The route is long and risky. Sustainable and secure Black Sea trade will only be possible once Crimea's status changes. Hodges has emphasized this point repeatedly. Ukraine cannot rebuild its economy while Crimea remains under occupation. All Black Sea ports can be blocked or easily disrupted. Even if Berdyansk and Mariupol are liberated, Russia will continue to block the Sea of Azov from Crimea. That is why Crimea is not merely a military target. It is the key to Ukraine's economic future and a critical link in the global food security chain. Every day the peninsula remains under occupation. Not only Ukraine, but also the dozens of countries dependent on Ukrainian grain pay the price. Hodges' three-stage model doesn't work in a vacuum. Isolation, making the situation unbearable, and economic pressure. For all three to be effective, a sustainable coalition behind Ukraine is needed, and that coalition exists, but it is not limitless. The most effective tools of the isolation phase came from allies. The Storm Shadow and Scalp cruise missiles provided by the UK and France struck the Black Sea Fleet headquarters in Sevastopol. That September 2023 attack was the tipping point that initiated the fleet withdrawal process. The HIMARS rockets systematically targeted railway junctions and ammunition depots, leading to Crimea. France's SCLP missiles also struck air defense positions in Crimea, expanding the corridors for Ukrainian drones, and the deployment of the F-16 fleet is changing the equation. Aircraft from the Netherlands, Denmark, and Norway have begun flying alongside Ukrainian pilots. The F-16 was not designed to establish air superiority over Crimea, but its JDAM-guided bombs and AMRAAM missiles add a new layer of threat that is straining Russia's air defense network around Crimea. But the coalition has its limits, and Hodges is aware of them. The range of ATACMS ballistic missiles is 300 kilometers, enough to strike the Kerch Bridge, but insufficient to reach logistical hubs deep within Russia. Germany refused to supply Taurus cruise missiles, the only conventional weapon with a 500-kilometer range, and a bunker-busting warhead capable of permanently disabling the Kerch Bridge's railway section. Berlin's refusal is political. Scholz hit the brakes out of fear of escalation. Drone components are another vulnerability. Ukraine's mid-range strike campaign relies on microchips made in Taiwan and South Korea. It relies on engines made in Canada and Austria, and targeting data provided by Western intelligence satellites. If any link in this supply chain breaks, the campaign's pace will slow. Hodges assesses this balance pragmatically. We haven't given Ukraine everything it needs, but it has succeeded with what we've provided, and every success builds a case for further support. The coalition isn't perfect, but it's working, and the results in Crimea, the withdrawal of the fleet, the collapse of air defense, and the breakdown of supply lines are proof that the coalition is working well enough. The question isn't whether support exists, it's how long it will last. We said that the Putin regime built its legitimacy on Crimea, but that legitimacy is now beginning to bleed, and the bleeding is coming from Crimea itself. In 2014, the annexation was met with enthusiasm by the Russian public. Crimea was a vacation destination, the most popular seaside resort after Sochi. A bridge was built, investments poured in, and Russian citizens flocked to the peninsula for cheap vacations. Crimea was supposed to be the showcase of a strong Russia. Today, that showcase has gone dark. Closures of the Kerch Bridge are now regular news. On May 16th, when no traffic was allowed for 11 hours, thousands of Russian citizens were stranded on both sides of the strait. Anger erupted on social media. Crimea is no longer a vacation spot, but a danger zone. Insurance companies are refusing to issue travel policies for the peninsula. Property prices in Sevastopol have dropped by more than 40% compared to 2021. Coastal apartments can't find buyers, and the mobilization crisis is hitting Crimea directly. The peninsula's Russian population is on the mobilization list. Men living in Crimea are being called to the front lines. In mainland Russia, it was possible to evade mobilization. Hundreds of thousands fled to Kazakhstan, Georgia, and Armenia. But in Crimea, there is no escape route. The bridge is under control, the ferry is limited, and the northern border is the front line. Mobilization in Crimea feels like being trapped on an island, because that's exactly what it is. The question of civilian evacuation is now even being discussed by Russian military bloggers. 2 million civilians, shrinking supply lines, increasing airstrikes. How could a potential evacuation operation be carried out, given the Kerch Bridge's already insufficient capacity? Russian defense analysts call this the Crimean paradox. While supplying the garrison grows more difficult, evacuating the civilian population is equally dependent on the same bottlenecks, and the issue of the Crimean Tatars adds an international dimension. The peninsula's indigenous people have been under systematic pressure since 2014. Home raids, arbitrary arrests, and the closure of the mailis. The UN Human Rights Council has documented this. As long as Crimea remains under occupation, this oppression deepens and adds a human rights dimension to Ukraine's argument for reclaiming the territory. Putin presented Crimea as a victory in 2014, but now that victory is quietly turning into a burden. Bridge closures are angering the Russian public. Mobilization is turning Crimea into a trap with no escape route. Property values are plummeting and civilian life is collapsing. The political cost of Crimea, a cost Putin never factored in, is now rivaling the military cost. The Crimea question is testing something bigger than a peninsula. Whether promises still mean anything, Ukraine surrendered the world's third-largest nuclear arsenal, 1,900 strategic nuclear warheads. In return, the Budapest Memorandum was signed. The United States, the United Kingdom, and Russia guaranteed Ukraine's territorial integrity and sovereignty. 20 years later, one of the guarantors invaded that territory. When Putin annexed Crimea in 2014, the other two guarantors, the US and UK, made strong statements and imposed sanctions, but no military action was taken to recover the peninsula. The Budapest Memorandum remained on paper, and a message went out to the world. If you surrender your nuclear weapons, your guarantee won't go beyond paper. The most attentive readers of that message were Tehran, Pyongyang, and Beijing. When Iran stepped back from nuclear negotiations, when North Korea accelerated missile tests, and when China increased its military presence in the Taiwan Strait, the same calculation lay behind all of it. Ukraine gave up its weapons. and couldn't be protected. Crimea's liberation reverses that calculation, not just for Ukraine, but for the global nuclear non-proliferation regime itself. If the peninsula remains occupied, the message is reinforced. Giving up nuclear weapons is strategic suicide. If it's retaken, the message changes. International commitments ultimately carry a cost. And the historical record says something clear. Since World War II, there is not a single example of occupied territory being recovered through negotiation alone. It was recovered either through the occupier's collapse or through military pressure. The Soviets withdrew from Eastern Europe, but only after economic collapse. Argentina couldn't recover the Falklands through negotiation. Britain used military force. Iraq didn't leave Kuwait at the negotiating table. Ukraine's Crimea strategy fits precisely into this historical pattern. Use military pressure to make the cost of occupation unsustainable, until the occupier sees withdrawal as being in its own interest. Hodges' three-phase model is the modern version of this pattern. You don't break the walls, you erode the will behind them. But every strong argument has a counter-perspective, and an honest analysis cannot ignore it. Hodges makes a compelling case. But intellectual honesty requires acknowledging what could go wrong. Russia's external supply chains haven't been cut. Iran provides drones. North Korea supplies over half of Russia's total artillery shells, and China's dual-use technology transfer continues. As long as these external arteries flow, Russia's overall war capacity doesn't drop to zero. Even if Crimea-specific supply degrades, Western support is the other variable. Ukraine's isolation strategy depends on the continued delivery of drone components, long-range strike capability, and intelligence support. If that support wavers, the timeline stretches dramatically, and a direct ground assault on Crimea is off the table. Perekop is one of Europe's most fortified choke points, and an amphibious landing would require naval capabilities Ukraine doesn't possess. Final liberation requires either a negotiated withdrawal or complete logistical collapse. Both take time. Hodges says we're closer to the end than the beginning, but how close depends on Western consistency. The momentum has shifted, but momentum isn't victory. The direction is visible on the ground, but the speed depends on factors neither side fully controls. Crimea was supposed to be Putin's greatest triumph, the crown jewel of a restored empire. Instead, it's becoming the anchor dragging Russia's war machine under. Every ruble spent defending it is a ruble not spent advancing. Every rerouted convoy is a frontline unit waiting longer for ammunition. Every air defense battery moved to Sevastopol is a coverage gap Ukraine's drones exploit somewhere else. Putin built a fortress, Ukraine is turning it into a cage. Ukraine's capabilities keep improving, Hodges says, and Russia knows it can't defend everything. The question is no longer whether Crimea can be retaken. It's how long Putin is willing to bleed for a peninsula he can no longer sustain. For the operational evidence of how this campaign is working day by day, the strikes, the routes, and the supply chain math, watch our next video. Make sure to subscribe to the Military Report for more breaking Russia-Ukraine war news, insights, and analysis. Thank you for watching.